This recording we're going to look at A'17 question 3, focused particularly on working capital management and also some ratio analysis as well. So we'll look at the requirements here. It's a 20-mark question. Firstly, you're asked to calculate the super earnings, investment and working capital, which means the euro figures. What's the euro figure in inventory, trade receivables, trade payables, and what's the and the company's working capital cycle. Another word for working capital cycle would be cash conversion cycle. So it's all calculations for 10 marks. Briefly discuss whether working capital cycle can be negative, 2 marks. Differences in working capital between a retail company and a company that's a manufacturer. So it's kind of your knowledge of the theory around working capital management. And then what would a conservative working capital strategy look like? What are the attributes or characteristics of it? So what I want to show you here is it's half and half. 50% of the marks are going for calculations, part A, but 50% of the marks are going for theory. So we're trying to show you the importance of knowing your theory, knowing your narrative pieces to Cap 1 Finance as well, because often that's where students get dragged down. So again, pause it now and have a read through the question and see, can you understand what they're asking you in part A? So Super Early is a manufacturing company. 2 months ago, the factory went on fire, causing damage, and most of the files were lost. But essentially what they're given here is an incomplete set of financial statements. So you see a lot of the unknowns. But you're also given some other information, some key ratios, the current ratio, the quick ratio, and you're told the gross profit margin as well. And essentially what you're trying to figure out, can we work back and figure out the unknowns? Now this is very much an applied style question, where the examiner is seeing, do you know how a set of financial statements is set up? And do you know what the ratios are telling you? So it's a very tricky one that you have to kind of work on the day of the exam. So don't panic when you see these. You have enough information, you need to work back. So we don't know what purchases and closing inventory are. That means we don't know what cost of sales is. And we don't know what inventory or receivables are. But what we do know is we know the current ratio is 1.75:1. So again, use your knowledge. Now pause the question and see, can you work out, it's like a little puzzle. Can I use the information here to work back and figure out what exactly are the unknowns? The first thing I know is my current ratio equals current assets is to current liabilities, which equals 1.75:1. Now, if we know what current liabilities are, they're 41. That means current assets must be 1.75 bigger. So that means in this case, our current assets, see the way you're trying to work back, are going to be 41 times 1.75. Which in this case are 72, or 71.75 to be exact. So that's what your current assets are. So again, did you spot that in the question? Did you know what you were looking for? So our current assets are 71.75. Of those, we know 5 are prepayments and 6 are bank and cash. So we can work out then what's left for closing entry and receivables. And what we're also told is the quick ratio was 0.9:1. So we know the quick ratio is current assets minus inventory is to current liabilities, which is 0.9:1. So that means we know current assets minus inventory equals 0, or where are we here, 41 times 0.9. Because we know the current liability, current assets minus inventory is 0.9 of current liabilities, and 41 times 0.9 is 36.9. So you know current assets minus inventories is 36.9. We know current assets are 71.75. 71.75 minus inventory equals 36.9. So that means your inventory is going to equal 71.75 minus 36.9. Right? That is not easy. Right? There's a lot going on there that you're trying to figure out. Just show you there. So you have to first figure out, use the current ratio to find out current assets. Then use the quick ratio to isolate what inventory is. Because the difference between the current ratio and the quick ratio is your inventory. So we now know inventory 34.85. We know trade receivables is the balancing figure we'll come back to. We know prepayments are 5, and we know bank is 6. And we know when we tot up all the current assets we said should 71.75. So you can work back to figure out then what trade receivables is. Trade receivables must be 71.75 minus inventory, minus the prepayment, minus the bank. So your trade receivables are 25.9. And again, all of these are getting marks as you go through. But what a lot of students struggled with was to start the question. They didn't know how to use the ratios, which you need to know going in. They don't tell you what the current ratio is. They don't tell you what the quick ratio is. But they tell you enough that if you know what it is, you can back into what these are. The last unknown figure then is up here. We don't know cost of sales, and we don't know purchases or closing inventory. But what we do know is, we know the gross profit margin, you're told in the question, is 40%. So what that means is, gross profit over sales equals 40%. Now that you might think, oh, I'm sure that's going to be no use to me. But that means cost of sales over sales must be 60%. Because it either is going to be gross profit or cost of sales. So that means your cost of sales here equals sales, which if we go up, your sales are 533 times 60%. And you can figure out your cost of sales to be 319.8. Right, so again, a lot of students would have struggled there trying to figure, how am I going to relate gross profit to cost of sales? Well, we know sales minus cost of sales is gross profit. So if 40% is left as profit, 60% must be as cost. We know opening inventory, you're given in the question, is 22. Purchases we don't know, and closing inventory we've already calculated to be minus 34.85. So remember, we're using the one we've calculated here, which a lot of students are poor at linking. We're using that 34.85. That's a current asset, but it's also in cost of sales. And that must be summing to 319.8 as your cost of sales. So again, you're using the information in the question. It's not direct, and that's why the examiner has warned about these applied style questions. You need to apply your knowledge to the facts of the question. And sometimes that will mean working on the day of the exam, not learning off something. You know what you're looking for, you're given ratios, and you work back. It's quite tricky. And I cover that applied style questions in your recordings just to talk you through and give you examples of other ones that have come up as well. So that means my purchases must be 319.8 minus the 22 and add back the 34.85. So your purchases here are 332.65. And the reason we calculate all of those now, we're going to need those to calculate our working capital cycle. So your first 5 marks are figuring the unknowns. And that means the investment in working capital. The investment in working capital is inventory, which is 34.85, plus trade receivables, which we said here we've worked out are 25.9, minus trade payables, which is given in the question. And trade payables are 29. So that means you're investing in working capital, which investing means the euro figure is 31,800. So that will get you your first 5 marks, 31,800, or if you want to be exact, 31,750. 31,750. So remember, be clear what's asked. They don't just ask you to solve for the unknowns. They ask you what's the investment in working capital. That means what's the euro figures in inventory, trade receivables, and trade payables. So that's your first protocol, is your starting point. But watch for the and then, that's why it's in bold, so you don't miss it, is the company's working capital cycle, also known as the cash conversion cycle. How you do this, very similar. Your working capital cycle, inventory days, plus trade receivable days, minus trade payable days. And your answer is going to be in days as well. So what you're looking at here then, is you're trying to figure out what is inventory days. And remember, you'll need to know the formula coming in. It won't be given to you on the day of the exam. That is not in your formula sheet. So inventory days is inventory divided by cost of sales times 365. So in our case here, it'll be 34.85 minus 319.8. That's why you need to calculate cost of sales times 365. So 34.85 divided by 319.8 times 365. And your answer there is 39.8 days. So what does that mean? It means on average, inventory is held for about 40 days before it's sold on. So that's an important insight as well, because again, you want to make sure that's as low as possible, because you don't want inventory sitting there for too long. But we're not asked to interpret it here. We're only asked to calculate it. So 39.8 or 40 days. Trade receivable days is trade receivables over credit sales times 365. If you don't have credit sales, you just use total sales. But a lot of students would have missed the little bullet point here. You're told in the question, credit sales are 90% of sales. So that means our credit sales here are 533 times 90%, which are 479.7, or 480 if you want, is fine. So that is your 25.9 trade receivables over 479.7 times 365. So it is, once you know the formulas, these can be nice and easy, but these are not given to you on the day of the exam, as you need to know them off by heart. So what this is here is, on average, it takes your customers 20 days to pay you. So on average, it takes your customers 20 days to pay you. And the last one then, trade payable days, is trade payables over credit purchases. That's why we have to figure out purchases, times 365. We're told in the question all purchases are on credit. So that means our payables are 29 over our purchases, which we've calculated, 332.65 times 365. So that is 32 days. So again, you can go to one decimal place if you want. I'll just leave it rounded just for ease. So what essentially that's saying is it takes you 32 days to pay your suppliers. So your working capital cycle, or if you wanted to call it the cash conversion cycle, it's 40 days to sell it, 20 days to get paid. So you're waiting 60 days in total, but you get 32 days grace from your suppliers. So that means your working capital cycle is around 28 days. That is how long it takes you from when you get paid from your customers between when you pay your suppliers. So you have to wait about 27.7 days or 28 days if you want. That's your working capital or your cash conversion cycle. So you want to have inventory days and trade receivable days as low as possible. You want to have trade payable days as high as possible. But as we've seen when you study working capital management, there are limits in terms of how far you can go with either of those. So that's a good question. It's an applied style question for 10 marks. But what I want you to remember now is, could you start the question? The examiner likes these applied style questions where they want to see, have you just learned off formula, or do you actually know what they mean? And can you work back in something that you mightn't have seen in that format before? And I've given you that. Look at the recording on the Cap 1 Finance overview and exam structure. I talk you through the applied style questions and give you plenty of examples of them. All right, so that's your part A, 10 marks. Part B, then C and D are the narrative pieces. And again, if you were smart in the exam, you might have started with B, C and D, because you could have done those that don't link to part A in terms of calculations. So you could have done those early on, got your 10 marks on the board, and got a bit of confidence as well. So think about the sequence you do questions in, as well as the overall questions you choose for the optional questions. So briefly discuss kind of working capital cycle being negative. Well, if you come back here and look at this, they have obviously a positive working capital cycle. Well, a company can have a negative working capital cycle, because if you have very low inventory days, because you're selling inventory very quickly, you have very low trade receivable days, because, for example, you're a cash business, you don't offer credit, and you take a good bit of credit from your suppliers because you have a lot of negotiating power, well, then you logically could have a negative working capital cycle. So it is possible. And a good example of that would be a supermarket. They sell inventory very quickly, so they have low inventory days. They don't offer trade credit to their customers because it's a cash business. And because they have such negotiating power, they get a lot of trade credit off the likes of Kellogg's or Unilever or Procter & Gamble because they're such a big size of their business. So a company like Supermarket will actually get paid by their customers before they have to pay their suppliers. So that's what a negative working capital cycle is. You don't need a big essay just to say whether it can be negative, it can, and a good student will give an example of a type of business. All right. The next one then we'd have talked about in detail in terms of the introductory to working capital. What's the difference between a retail sector and a manufacturing sector? Right. Well, think about it from an inventory perspective. Retail sector usually only has one type of inventory, finished goods. A manufacturing sector would have raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods. So that's a key difference straight away. Retail sector usually has no trade receivables or very limited, because most of the retail sector we're talking about is business to consumer. So the likes of Next, H&M, Boots, Dunnes Stores, they don't offer credit. Right? So when you go in, you pay by cash, you pay by card, but it's instant. There's no waiting around for the money. Whereas a manufacturing sector, often a manufacturing company, like Kellogg's manufacture cereal, etc., they will offer credit because they're selling to other businesses, so it's part and parcel of the working capital management. So trade receivables usually can have a high level, or manufacturers can usually have a high level of trade receivables. Both of them will probably still have trade payables, so there mightn't be a huge difference there. Right? But certainly in terms of inventory and in terms of trade receivables, there will be two key differences. So what you want to do is you want to list out then the key differences. You're talking about no inventory, a lot of inventory, no trade receivables, a lot of trade receivables. You'll talk similar, there mightn't be any difference in terms of trade payables, but that's still talking about and discussing it. So what you're talking about here, discuss the differences. You're probably talking about two key differences, but with a bit of detail, because discuss is different than briefly discuss, or it's different than outline. So you want a small bit of detail just to show that you're aware of what's going on. And then lastly, discuss the attributes or characteristics of a company that operates a conservative working capital strategy. So remember now when you studied working capital, you had an aggressive working capital strategy, a conservative, and a neutral. In conservative, you hold high levels of current assets. You have a lot of money tied up in inventory. You have a lot of money tied up in trade receivables, right? So that means you have no liquidity issues. So you're not going to be stuck for liquidity, all right? But what you're also going to have is a high level of long-term finance. So it's very conservative. It works well when you have a recession because you're not stuck for money or stuck for funding, but it can be seen as inefficient because you have a huge amount of money tied up in your current assets. That means you'll have a very high current ratio, and that suggests you have too much money, you're overcapitalized. Because if you have money tied up in inventory or tied up in trade receivables, it's not generating a return. Whereas if you took that money and put it into non-current assets, new productive equipment, new expansion of building or property, that'd generate a better return. So a conservative working capital strategy is a high current ratio, high investment in working capital, no liquidity issues, but generally seen as inefficient for working capital. But it usually is suitable to when there is a recession in the economy. And so what the examiner is probably looking there for 4 attributes for 4 marks, or maybe 3 or 2 in a bit more detail, but certainly put down enough that you're comfortable that you'll get your marks. But remember there, part B, C and D now is all narrative. You either know or you don't. The examiner is not looking for long essays here. It's very much bullet points. 1 or 2 sentences in each point, get your marks and move on. Because you will be tight for time across the paper. So that whole question, Autumn 17 question 3, very good applied style question. We are to apply your knowledge of ratios, apply your knowledge of working capital cycle to a question you might have been used to before. But the examiner is using those in 17, 18 and 19 to see your students learning the material rather than just learning it off. Do they actually understand what's going on and can they apply their knowledge? Watch out for other types of those questions which I'll flag in my recordings. And then the other half was looking at working capital narrative, which is a big takeaway from this question and from your study in general, it's going to be about half and half in the exam. And traditionally, students are doing poorer on the narrative than they are in the calculations. So do not neglect that in Cap 1 Finance.